Good afternoon. My name is Leong. I teach in the Human Rights Program at Suzhou University, Taipei. I'm very privileged to have Dr.梁家恩 with us, that we would interview him on his teaching and research experience through the years. Dr. Liang is an old colleague and a very dear friend of mine for a long years, and he has been doing very creative and fascinating study on the situation on Southeast Asia, in particularly concern the drive of this nation, the urge of this nation to reach a cohesive narrative. And in the process of doing that, had inflicted much pain and suffering on their people, creating a myth of their nation, and in so many cases engaged in gross violation of human rights. Dr. Liang was born and brought up in Malaysia and was educated in UK first, and then returned to National University of Singapore. From that university, he was awarded a PhD. I think we should at this point invite him to tell us something about himself, his family background, his teaching and research project, and us. Later, I hope we had opportunity to go into it. His encounter with the state of Malaysia, which was not a very pleasant experience, described in his essay written for the inaugural issue of Taiwan Human Rights Journal. Dr. Liang, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, So thank you for for giving me this opportunity to actually come here and to kind of give a little bit of the background about my own work, and of course about my own personal background as well. I'll start things off by talking a little bit about my own kind of upbringing in Malaysia on the island of Penang. So I grew up in a small family, and I grew up in this island of Penang. And of course, within Penang itself, right, and within Malaysia, in terms of its multicultural context, I was exposed to different kinds of cultures, different kinds of people, and I've always grown up in that kind of environment where we have different languages and different peoples to be dealing with. On one hand, my parents are native Cantonese speakers, and outside we would have people, we'd be living within this environment where a majority of the people are Fujian speakers, and then of course we have Malay being used and English, of course being the kind of consequence of living in a post-colonial situation as well. I've always kind of felt very proud and felt very thankful for having grown up in that kind of environment, because it allowed me to then grow accustomed to different kinds of cultures as I myself moved to as I grew up over those years, including into when I began my career as an undergraduate and graduate student, and finally with the combination of my PhD in these different places. So that's kind of like my own personal background. So it's a typical family. We've got 3 kids in the family, and our parents, of course, growing up on this little island, kind of given exposure to these different cultures. And so with that, right, I took this baggage, or rather I took these experiences to the US, where I studied political science. And it was in a university in the state of Vermont. It's an extremely beautiful state, and very green, very lush. Strangely enough, I chose a university that was located in a very rural environment. It's a faraway place, and people there were just stuck on campus and we had nothing to do except to just study or whatever else that the students were doing on campus. It was there that one of the deepest kind of impressions that were made on me was when I picked a major in political science, and in political science itself, I was then really attracted to some of the courses that were being offered by this professor of mine who came from Iran. And he was teaching, his name is Fariborz Mokhtari, and I still keep in touch with him. And he was responsible for courses in political theory. We had several kind of concentrations that you could choose from. So there would be public administration, international relations, and political theory was something that I was really attracted to. And it was because of the way he was teaching and because of the materials that he exposed us to that I developed a love for political theory. And this love for political theory or political philosophy would then grow on into my project, would go on into this program that I enrolled myself in at the graduate level, also in America. So it was within this particular kind of environment and through the guidance of this particular professor, and of course other professors as well, that I thought, okay, so this is an extremely interesting field and I would really love to go more into it. And after that I decided to choose to do my graduate studies at Northeastern University, which is located in the city of Boston, in the state of Massachusetts. And I spent 2 years there. And again, right, one of the things I concentrated most on was political theory or political philosophy. And so it was a little bit more intense. I was working under the professor by the name of Gerald Bursey, and these seminar courses that I was exposed to just expanded, right? It expanded my love for it, and it made me wanted to study more. And it was at that point in time, two things. This experience that I had in the US at an undergraduate level first exposed me to not only what it is that I had to study, international relations, political theory, but it also got me to become a lot more interested in Malaysia. Because I think if it wasn't for the fact that I was given the opportunity to study in the US, I wouldn't have been exposed to a lot of things that I myself kind of dug up on in terms of my own study of Malaysia. Staying in Malaysia for a while, right, or being in that Malaysian environment for a while made me realize that there were things that you could see and there were things that you couldn't see.
Yes, let me interrupt you.
Sorry.
I neglect to refer to your experience in the United States. I did not read about much of your experience in the United States. Is it that for some reason you did not emphasize that? But anyhow, am I right that, can we say that your family background, where you were brought up, certainly have much to do with what you are today, but then a second source of influence, so to speak, is political philosophy. That is not that easy for me to detest. But from your paper, of course, I picked up, and I don't know if we had opportunity to discuss this later. Certainly, that you are very much taken by Foucault, and later on by Arendt. Am I right?
I think it was Arendt first and then Foucault.
Ah, I see. Okay, we'll come back to them later if we had the opportunity. So you are so that your family background and your education, and then that this early year of your education in the United States has such an impact which I did not pick up. Now, so that you later move on to UK and return to Singapore. Okay, and will you care to say a few words about your education and training in UK and Singapore briefly?
Okay, sure. In the UK, I did a second master's after I finished my first one in the US, and that was at the Human Rights Center of the University of Essex. And there I concentrated on, I took many courses, again one of them being political theory, but I was also exposed to international law. So I also developed an interest in study of genocide, even though my thesis was actually in the University of Essex, where it was on the Malaysian Human Rights Commission. But what I was really more interested in was the concept of genocide. So I kind of took that and I brought it over to Singapore, which is where I then applied to the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at NUS, and I was granted admission, where my focus was on the East Timorese Truth Commission. And so in that sense, right, there's that kind of connection between NUS and the University of Essex.
Yes, quite clearly from my perspective, you have been building up your research project block by block, and I think that explains when later year that your research come to fruition, so that you can have so much to say about Southeast Asia and about, like say, how they attempt to hold on their stay together and to go for, as I had said, to go for this cohesive narrative and to create means and in the process engage in such gross violation of human rights. Now, that let me begin by saying in your first essay that you wrote for us, that is in the Taiwan Journal, the Journal of Taiwan Human Rights, that really you have provided a very comprehensive overview of the Southeast Asia country as a whole, with focus on, if I remember correctly, focus on Singapore, on Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor, Cambodia, so that at that time you already had Southeast Asia in mind. Even later on, you emphasize much more on in your research on East Timor and Indonesia. Now, in your article, let me refer to this. You related your not very pleasant experience with the police of the state of Malaysia. What does that mean to you for your later thinking and research?
Okay, so I think I'll just talk a little bit first about what happened, just to give a little bit of background. I inserted that description of my experience with Malaysian police, with Malaysian authorities, into the article. Is due to the fact that at one point in time I gave a presentation in Singapore, one of the fairly well-known institution that works specifically on Southeast Asian studies. It does a lot of research in Southeast Asian studies. So I went there, I gave a paper, and I said a couple of things about how that sometimes the situation in Malaysia is ripe for politicians to manipulate certain things, like for instance race, religion, stuff like that. And so what I mentioned when I was talking about these issues, it was picked up by a particular person who I think was sent by the Malaysian embassy in Singapore. And after that, when I went back to the university that I was teaching at in Malaysia at that time, it's a private university, I think I received a phone call saying that, hey, are you Leong Karian? Did you go to this conference on this particular day? Would you like to come down to the police station and have a conversation with us? And then of course that freaked me out, because this had never happened to me before. But it was much later that I realized that this is actually a pattern that you can discern from the kinds of, from what other academics in Malaysia, more critical academics in Malaysia have also experienced as well. And so it kind of brought to me this whole thinking about how, so there are certain things that you can say, there are certain things you cannot say, and these things that you cannot say are pretty much defined by what the authority says you can or cannot do. So the authority has that kind of power, at least in Malaysia, to be able to kind of tell you these are the kind of markers that we have put in place, and that you can't go beyond these markers. And that if you do, right, then there'll be a couple of things. You'll be slapped on the wrist, or you'll be told to go to a police station, or sometimes some of us even get charged. So it was also at that time I began to think, right, are there then certain stories that cannot be revealed? What are these things that we can't talk about? And why is it that there are these certain things that we can't talk about? So what are the underlying reasons? What are the underlying structural reasons? What are the underlying institutions that stops us from saying certain things? So in that sense, right, I also began to think, now, if there are things that we can't talk about, is there also an indication, right, by looking at the things that we can't talk about, that there are also things that are hidden to that extent?
Yes, I think, yes, you are quite right. By now, of course, we understand better that almost all the government in Southeast Asia impose to different degree control on their people. They were, and they still are, I would assume, very suspicious of their intellectual. It would appear that the intellectual are troublemaker almost everywhere in the world. And so that from the very beginning that you somehow belong to this category, that say they stay, or some their supporter, their apologists always come back and say, we do this for stability, for political and social stability. We do this for the good of the whole society and the community. So that for you and for me, this argument will not go anywhere, because it has been proved that they had violated human rights, and they had brought about such suffering and pain. But are we not confronted with a question, how are we going to compete with the state for the heart and mind of the people? That in some, or in almost all countries, I'm thinking on Southeast Asia, I'm thinking of China, and certainly in Taiwan and earlier, and to lesser degree in a Western country, just witnessed the Trump administration, for example. Like, how are we going to compete with the state, saying that we are right and the government wrong? That somehow they have succeeded to persuade the people that they are right, and these dissenting intellectual or some of the professional class, they are troublemaker, and it is the right thing to do to put them in jail or worse. How will you respond to that? How are we going to reach the people?
Okay. I think whenever I, in terms of relating this question, I mean, this is a huge question.
Yes, yes. It may not be very fair that I spring on you like that, but that is always fascinating.
Right, right. It is, and it's also one of the things that also gets me to continue to further on working on the topics that I'm working on as well, because I at this point in time I don't profess to be an activist. I mean, but what I do is, or what I feel that I do is that I'm adding on a more critical element to how the society understands itself, whether we're talking about Malaysia, whether we're talking about Indonesia or Singapore, because a lot of the people that I've engaged with is especially when we talk about political philosophers or people who are searching for mass graves of who they believe to be buried in a particular place, they have stories to tell. And so I see part of what it is that I try to do in terms of my own research and work is that I approach these people, I reach out to them, I collect their stories for posterity, so that these stories will have a record, and that these record through and that as a record and through my writings, right, these records will be exposed to people in terms of allowing people to know that such a thing has happened. So I've been doing this consistently in a lot of the articles that I've been writing about, especially on Indonesia, but also in terms of looking at Malaysia, looking at Singapore, especially that article in that journal, right? What I try to do also is that by engaging with books that are not typically read by people, and I expose it so that people would know. So I guess in that sense, right, I shine a light on these issues.
Yes. I appreciate what you say. I'm playing the role of the devil's advocate, and the devil's advocate always come back and say, how are we going to deal with that?
Mm-hmm.
And then certainly now you say you are not an activist and you are not a revolution. But indeed that some of the more persuaded, some of the human rights activists that who come back with the argument that we cannot wait for the verdict of the posterity of the generation to come, that our people are suffering. We had to act, we had to rise up, and what is your counter argument?
Well, that's another big question. I think in typically when we look at a lot of Southeast Asian societies, or societies for that matter, right, in terms of rectifying human rights violations, right, a lot of things get buried in the past. And so to that extent, right, I think to be able to, at least in terms of looking at Malaysia and in Indonesia, they have gone through revolutionary moments of them. So to that extent, right, these societies have already gone through to a large extent political reform. So I would also expect, right, that the days of revolution in these two countries are kind of past as far as what people are able to kind of deal with or what they're able to accept at this point in time. So, but I think one of the important things, right, is that in terms of being able to carry on through with the reform movement, right, there has to be a certain level of momentum. And that momentum can only be maintained, I believe, if people realize that there are a lot of these other narratives, other stories that are hidden underneath. So So one of the problems that we find a lot in Southeast Asian countries, right, is that there is only a specific kind of monolithic narrative that is being offered to the people. And it is almost always underlined by the fact that if we deviate from this particular narrative, then we will then go through a situation where everything's going to fall apart. There's going to be instability, chaos, and those elements that you mentioned just now. So in order for people to stop feeling that the government's narrative is the only other narrative that can guarantee stability and or harmony for the rest of society, I believe that to the extent that where I can refer to myself either as an activist or a troublemaker is to constantly be able to remind people that there is something else and that there are groups of people that are forgotten, right? So that the reform movement will continue.
Okay, tell us a little bit more about this reform movement. For example, like let's say in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Indonesia, so that we will know better how we can assess the momentum which you place a great deal of emphasis.
I'll start talking about Indonesia first, and then I'll move on from there, because it's due to the fact that I've been working mostly in Indonesia for the past few years. So the situation in Indonesia is that since 1998 there's been a change of government, right, where the rule of this one particular man and his regime had been going on for a good 30 years. And so in 1998, right, was that first step that Indonesia took in terms of its democratization. And from there, right, we've seen the country go through leaps and bounds. It is still limited in terms of what it is that it can do, because there continues to exist within it pockets of what I would call the remains of an authoritarian enclave. And so you still have the ghosts of Suharto kind of, it's existing within small little pockets in the current government up until this point in time. So one of the kind of leftovers, right, from that particular era is the fact that there is still, to that extent, right, this inability, at least within the Indonesian state, to talk about what happened in 1965, which is when there was a large-scale massacre of suspected leftists and pro-communists, members of the Communist Party of Indonesia, which at that point in time was the third largest communist party in the world. These massacres is basically the foundation for Suharto's rule. So even when he was toppled, and even when the government was democratizing, they still weren't able to talk about this. And I think that reform to that extent, right, and also now it's also further complicated by Islamic politics. One of the biggest kind of obstacles to what I want to refer to as full democratization is that inability of the state to realize and to be able to talk about how in the past this had happened. And so my work over the past few years has been to try to dig out, right, the ways in which people have been talking about it, despite the taboo that has been brought in. My research is about what the kinds of methods that people use to maintain the life of these stories, even though the state and society at large refuses to accept the fact that these things have happened. To be fair, right, I haven't written about Malaysia in a very long time, and I haven't actually done that. I haven't written a lot about Malaysia. Because
Why?
Well, it's number one, it's home for me. I still look at Indonesia as I'm familiar with it, but I'm not so familiar with it. So at the same time, I'm an outsider as well as being an insider at the same time.
Degree of detachment.
Correct. Singapore is very complex to me, because and I find it difficult to write sometimes about Malaysia, because I'm so much a part of it. I've always felt that Malaysia it's too bound together. It's too kind of stuck in the kind of narratives that the state and even sometimes its own people believe so much in, right? In that, okay, this is where we are at this point in time. We have these things that we can't talk about. We have these things that we can't approach. And if we do, especially when it was, especially in reference to race, right, it's something that is going to bring the whole system down. And so to that, I've always had this feeling, right, that Malaysia is ossified in this kind of position. But quite recently, I've also written about, it's unpublished at this point in time. It's not a very well written piece, but so far what I've been working on as well is actually an extension of the essay that I had contributed to the Taiwan Journal of Human Rights. And so in that book, I only look specifically at the experiences of former political detainees that were arrested at that point in time. And through my readings of these biographies of these people who were arrested under that law at that point in time, 2 periods of time actually, the mid-70s and the late 80s. I went through the biographies written by these two former political detainees, and it was actually kind of fascinating because it revealed to me, right, that on one hand, you have a group of people, you have the state, and you have a group of people who ascribe to a very racialized view of the world. And then on the other hand, if you go through these biographies, these were two individuals that came from totally different religious and racial backgrounds. And yet, because of the similar kind of experiences that they had gone through whilst being detained without trial, right, and being detained in in prisoner camps meant for political prisoners and whatnot, you could discern from that a kind of vision that went above and beyond race and religion, right? That was based on class, that was based on the common idea that regardless of who you were, right, but despite your race and your religion, right, the human experience was the same in terms of how the government treated these people. So
yes, I think you are quite right. For me, that this authoritarian government, how they violate human rights, how they deprive their people of right and freedom, tend to be not that different. Now we turn to later year in Malaysia. We heard about this clean politics movement to make politics
clean.
Would you care to say a few words about that?
Yes, actually, the clean in Malay means bersih. Bersih is a movement that came together in the years of 2013, 2014, where as an organization, which was an agglomeration, they got together to push for free and fair elections, right? But it actually, if we look further back, right, this entire movement up until that point in time, right, had begun, had actually come together in 1998 as part of the reform movement. And so it was from there where we began to see the rise of these different political parties asking for change, asking for reform, asking for cleaner government, asking for the end of the culture of corruption in Malaysia. That it was only in 2008 the ruling government, or the ruling coalition at that time, was in a sense not defeated, but a large percentage of the majority was taken away from them. And then it was from there, right, that a lot of people began to realize that there is actually going to be this possibility where people were able to get together on a platform that was multiracial. And so it was from there, right, that these different NGOs then began to capitalize on having free and fair elections in Malaysia. And that became the kind of battle call for a lot of these different NGOs. And a battle call, more importantly, that would be able to go above and beyond what we would typically find in Malaysian politics, which is that emphasis on race and religion. And so towards 2018, because of this momentum that had been going on since 1990, right, more than 20 years, right, or around 20 years, that we then see a change in terms of governance in Malaysia. So bersih was a big part of that.
Any comparative change in Singapore?
There have been comparative changes, yes. There have been, the government over the past few years in Singapore has been more reactive in terms of what it is that the people there want. There was a point in time where as we approached 2008, post-2008, after the Asian financial, after the subprime mortgage crisis, after the financial crisis that affected most of the world, right? It was more of a kind of sort of backlash, I guess, from people, where a lot of Singaporean nationals found that they were in this kind of situation where the economy wasn't so good, and when they saw that so much opportunities had been given to non-Singaporeans instead. So to that extent, there was this kind of sense of anger from the people towards the government, and so the government then ceded more and more rights to that extent to its people. And over the past elections, what we've experienced also is kind of a dip in terms of the people's support for the PAP. And it's becoming quite interesting as well because as issues like LGBT rights pick up, and as issues like, for instance, over the issues pertaining to the death penalty in Singapore, these are things that kind of have been picking up momentum in Singapore as well, to the extent, right, that it is kind of sort of a rallying call for a lot of Singaporeans in Singapore.
But there is not an effective opposition party yet.
No, not as yet. There are a few new voices. They have been kind of sort of vocal, but I think what has been going for the main party in Singapore right now is the fact that they have been able to manage COVID pretty well. So that sense of confidence is still there in terms of as far as people are concerned, right? But I think in terms of looking at human rights issues, looking at how NGOs are, it's pretty interesting over the next. It's been pretty interesting looking at the developments in Singapore this past few years with new groups coming up. In fact, there's a new group called Transformative Justice that has been doing a lot of work advocating for the rights of prisoners that have been found to be that have to be found on death row, especially death penalty. So we've had a couple of Malaysians who have been found guilty and have been sentenced to death. And just quite recently, one has been sentenced to death. But this was an issue that allowed this NGO to bring this thing to the fore. And I think there was also a series of protests at the People's Corner, the Speaker's Corner, sorry, in Singapore on this issue. So it's been quite interesting.
Yeah. Now, if we take Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, some of the other Southeast Asia nations, can we say they are moving out of this earlier period of the gross violation of human rights?
Yes, we can. I think to the extent when we talk about human rights violations, these governments have been quite wary of the possibility of how the international community pay the kind of attention that can be focused on these countries if there are allegations of human rights violations, and so they're quite reactive to what the international community thinks about them. But we've also seen a lot more activists and a lot more academics taking up a lot of these issues within Southeast Asia. But that's not to say that they don't continue to face harassment from the authorities. So in the context of Singapore, there have been a lot of academics who have been very vocal in investigating that period of Singapore history, or investigating rather the Singapore story narrative. So we've got the Singapore story narrative as a narrative which focuses primarily on the role of the then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew as being the modern founding, the founding father of the modern Singapore state. But within those times as well, you also have a group of people that the entire story wasn't just about Lee Kuan Yew. There had been a group of people who were also a big part of Singapore becoming an independent nation, and also contributed to the Singapore story just as much as Lee Kuan Yew. So there's been this one particular scholar, Tam Bin Jin, that has been doing a lot of work in looking at an alternative Singapore. In Malaysia, I've had colleagues who have done the same thing, where they are looking at how, especially in terms of this one particular incident in Malaysia, these series of racial riots that we had in 1969, May 13th. It's a very sensitive topic in Malaysia, but I've had colleagues working on it as well, and there's so much more room that these academics have in terms of in terms of maneuvering, in terms of doing these kinds of works, despite the fact that they still face harassment. And then the same thing is in Indonesia as well. As we begin to see more and more of these stories, you then begin to see also how a lot of these narratives are loosening their hold over the minds of people. And it helps also that in Southeast Asia we have different methods of which people can then be able to obtain information. We have the internet, right? We have podcasts. We have greater space for a certain level of public discussion about these issues. So it is beginning to unravel. It is not a revolution in that sense, but it has now become an issue of access, and there's easier access. And if people want to access this kind of information, they can. And in that sense, right, that's a pretty big threat to the meta-narrative that a lot of these states in Southeast Asia have.
I agree with you to a certain degree, but quite a few Southeast Asia nations to this day are still very oppressive, or have been turning more and more oppressive. Take for example the Philippines is a case in point. Cambodia certainly had not improved that much. So that to that degree you have some situation you can be more optimistic than others. So that can I type you as on the whole fairly optimistic? And let me again put this difficult question to you, that as intellectual, do we not tend to exaggerate our influence?
Definitely. we are constantly doing that on a daily basis. But I think to that extent, right, there's so many things I think that a lot of these other countries in Southeast Asia, aside from Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, there's so much more these other Southeast Asian countries are able to do in terms of improving their own human rights situations, that's for sure. But at the same time, at least in the case of the Philippines, is Bongbong Marcos being elected to become the president and having Sara Duterte as the vice president, is it bad news?
I think it's very bad news.
But yeah, it is bad news, seeing as it is how since 2016, right, Duterte has been carrying out this policy, his drug war. Now there's a case in the ICC against him, and that it's quite clear, right, that these cases of extrajudicial killings in the Philippines form a pattern, and you can quite clearly argue that these are crimes against humanity. But we also have to take into consideration, I mean, we have to ask the question, right, in that why is it that BBM, Bongbong Marcos, and the Marcos family happen to continue to have such a powerful hold over the imagination of people. It's because of the memory of this dictator which continues to exert itself over Philippine politics. And you see that quite obviously in Indonesia as well, right? You sometimes, depending on the kind of elections that they're having at the presidential level, at the local level, you still see posters of Suharto being posted up and saying, wasn't it better during my times? You know, to kind of tell people, to kind of exhibit to people that, you know, things were so much better back then because there was so much more stability and calm.
Am I right? And we have been reading from the news report that Marcos certainly has succeeded in turning around his father's record.
Yes.
And saying that his father had done so well for the Philippines, relying very much on false information and by the use of social media.
Yes.
In this case, it will appear that the social media is a kind of two-edged sword. Okay, it helped access to the information, but at the same time can be so manipulated.
Yes, absolutely. So as far as I believe that as far as the institutions in the Philippines are concerned, I guess they still work, but the problem now is the fact that we have a group of younger electors that mainly access their information through social media, right? Because if we look at a lot of the mainstream news outlets in the Philippines, right, they're definitely against BBM. They're very critical of Marcos and their role in the past.
Right.
But because of the fact that now we have so much more younger electorates depending on the internet or on social media specifically for information, that things can become a little bit more, that things have become so much more malleable in terms of whoever it is. I know there is also a movement because if we look at Leni Robredo, she has done pretty well also compared to, of course, Marcos. I mean, the first time when Leni Robredo went up against BBM, right, BBM lost, right? And to that extent, BBM has had that time to prepare for the elections at this point in time. But, so Leni Robredo has been the VP up until quite recently. And so she has also been able to build up this large group of people who have now become volunteers for her. And she's brought a lot of all these other issues to the fore as well. So I think the battle is not yet done. And it's also very interesting because at this point in time, I know a few scholars who are also very involved and very intent on maintaining this resistance against the kind of narrative that the Marcoses are trying to build up at this point in time. And that they are constantly reminding the people that this is not, the Marcoses are not exactly who they present themselves to be, right? That there is this other kind of story, and that story revolves around the period of martial law period in the Philippines and Marcos's role in it. So there's been a lot of work currently being done on this as well. A lot of these different alternative historians, and especially with the colleagues that I know in the Philippines.
Up to this point, I had not brought up China and the influence of China. And that, of course, again, we can spend hours talking about China. At this point, if you could briefly state what China means for Southeast Asia nation through the decades and at this time, just really later on we should have opportunity to dwell on that again.
Okay. For the past few decades, or at least from the 70s onwards, right, China, to a certain extent, has been looked at quite suspiciously. But in these few years, right, with the rise of China and given the large amount of ethnic Chinese people that we have in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, definitely, it's seen as a rising but benign giant on the economic front, right? But militarily speaking, it would appear to be a bit of a threat, especially when we talk about the contentious issues that we have with them over the SPRAC needs and over other issues, of course.